Okay, so it's 9:30, so we'll make a start. So good morning and welcome to everyone. Welcome back to some of you. These are the stage 2 hearing sessions following on from the stage 1 hearing sessions, which were held some time ago. My name's Elaine Worthington. Next to me is Louise Crosby. We are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 to carry out the independent examination of the Shropshire Local Plan. We will refer to the document as the plan during the hearing sessions. Most people will have spoken to Kerry Truman, the Programme Officer for the examination dealing with administrative matters, or her colleague Ian Bussey. They're your first point of contact if you've got any queries about procedures for the hearing sessions or the examination generally, and they will be based here for the duration of the hearing sessions. Just housekeeping to start with. Can everybody hear? Yeah. So microphones, everybody needs to use them. It's the right button for on and then back for off. If you could turn them off when you're not speaking. And if obviously it's all being captured, so if there's anything you don't want hearing, then please make sure they're off. Mobile phones turn to silent. Are the press here? Nope. So the council will be recording the sessions and then uploading them onto the website. Does anyone have any objections to being filmed? No. Fire alarm. Would you mind doing that, Mr. West? Because I don't want it to have changed from last week.
Yeah, it's the same as last week. So there's no alarm proposed today. So if it happens, it's the real thing. So we would have to go out that way, all that way. Basically, I'll lead the way if that's the case. But there's not one proposed today, so we shouldn't be interrupted. Hopefully.
That's great. Thank you. So the guidance notes explain more about the examination. We've identified a number of matters and issues for this stage of the hearings which will be investigated, taking account of representations made on the plan and the additional evidence. Today's hearing session will be based on those matters and issues. There are some proposed main modifications to the plan. So document GC4M is the latest version dated July 2024. Any main modifications that arise out of the hearing sessions may need consulting upon, and further sustainability appraisal may also be required at the end of the final hearing sessions. So this session is open to the public to observe, but only participants around the table are able to speak. Also, we need to stress that the hearing sessions aren't an opportunity for participants to introduce points that were not covered in their Regulation 19 statements or in response to the Council's subsequent consultation. I should also say that, and this is in the guidance note, that we won't be hearing any evidence about emission sites. Should we find that the Council need to allocate sites, it will be for them to go ahead and do. So there will be a mid-morning and mid-afternoon breaks. Probably today we'll aim to break about 11 for a short break and then lunch at 12:30, but we can see how things are going and flex that a bit. It's helpful if people can be seated and ready to begin sessions at the allocated time and return promptly from breaks. So the hearing session it's a relaxed and informal discussion focusing on the particular matter considered. We've produced an agenda which is based on our original matters and issues paper and in light of other statements received from the council and others. So we'll be asking a series of questions of the council and then asking others to contribute as appropriate. Everyone will be given adequate opportunity to speak if they wish to do so. I think today, given the numbers, if when we go through the questions on the agenda, if you want to speak on a particular question, then it's better just to put your nameplate on its end and we can deal with whoever's relevant rather than going right round, and then you'll be brought into the discussion. We're aware that not everybody is used to such events, and we'll try to ensure that everyone is able to contribute and make their case. So finally, you don't need to repeat comments from statements or repeat comments made by other people. The matters don't carry any more weight depending on how many people have touched on them. I think that's everything on opening. Oh, the car park. Mr. West, will you do the car park for fear of me going back?
Yeah, it's just to confirm that if you are new to this, we all went here last week, you have to put your registration into the box downstairs in reception. If everyone has done that, that's fine. If you haven't, please go and put your reg in now, because there is a chance you might end up with a fine at the end of the day. So if you haven't done, please go and do it now.
Thank you. Okay, looks like we're all fine with the car parking. So if we move to the agenda then for matter 4, which is concerning employment, land, need and supply surrounding policy SP2. So before we move to the questions, just in terms of the background, obviously we had the stage 1 hearings which considered housing and employment needs under matter 4. The plan identified in policy S2 an employment requirement of 300 hectares. It's also the council's intention that plan should provide 30 hectares of employment land over the plan period to address a need for employment land in the Black Country. Following the initial hearings, we asked the council to provide a bit of clarity on the employment requirement. Following from that was the housing and employment topic paper, which proposes a 20 hectare uplift to the employment land requirement, and that the 30 hectare contribution to the Black Country should be accommodated at an already proposed employment site at Shirehall. The uplift is to be met by utilising settlement guidelines and windfall allowance. So given the cross-cutting nature of all of that, some of the issues around employment requirement and supply as well actually were covered last week under matter 1 when we considered the SA, and again under matter 2 when we looked at the spatial strategy. We also established last week that the need figures for the Black Country on housing as well as employment, though perhaps not perfect, are where we are, and are not really up for any further discussion as part of today's session, because they are, in practical terms, the basis from which we are now working. We also discussed last week the issues surrounding site SHR 166 in Shrewsbury and the council's revised position in light of the revised statement of common ground with Historic England. Obviously, some of these things will come up today, but I thought it was important to set out where we'd already got to. So question 1 on the agenda is the updated approach to the employment land requirement and supply set out in the topic paper for a minimum of 320 hectares of employment land over the plan period justified, positively prepared and consistent with national policy. So that's quite all-encompassing, so I thought it might be helpful just initially to split that into requirement and supply so we're not all getting confused. So if we start with the revised approach to requirement, if we could do that first. Can I ask the council, well, would the council like to kick us off on that, just on requirement, if we can?
Thank you, Ma'am. I'm doing better with the sun at the moment, but if it causes me a problem, I'll be moving around. Yeah. The council has now identified an employment land requirement for a minimum of 320 hectares from 2016 to 2038. This will combine 2 separate needs. Firstly, to deliver 290 hectares of employment land for Shropshire, and secondly, to deliver 30 hectares towards unmet employment land needs in the Black Country. The updated additional sustainability appraisal report assessed reasonable alternatives for meeting those needs. Chapter 7 of the report assessed whether or not to make the 30 hectare contribution to the Black Country. Chapter 9 assessed 3 reasonable alternatives for meeting Shropshire's employment land needs. These 3 alternatives were considered separately, and then each was combined with the contribution to the Black Country. The council has therefore assessed 6 alternatives in total, which were identified in figure 9.1, page 112 of GC 44. All of these alternatives start from a baseline need for 250 hectares for Shropshire, which was found sound in ID 28 and ID 36. Chapter 14 of the updated Housing and Employment topic paper considers these reasonable alternatives and confirms the employment land requirement at 320 hectares, pursuing a high growth strategy for Shropshire with a 15% uplift on our baseline need of 250 hectares, and that this should also include the 30 hectare contribution towards meeting unmet needs in the Black Country. The Council considers the employment land requirement is justified, positively prepared and consistent with national policy. The requirement provides for objectively assessed needs and also needs that cannot be met by neighbouring authorities in accordance with MPPF paragraph 11b. The Council considers that this will deliver a step change in economic performance in Shropshire to offer higher quality investment and employment opportunities. We consider that we've met the labour demand needs in the Edna, which have been found sound. We've shown early and proportionate and effective engagement with our stakeholders, investors and communities, consistent with MPPF para 16C. We've shown effective ongoing joint working and worked towards a positively prepared and justified strategy for Shropshire, consistent with MPPF paragraph 26 and 35b. We've also built a mutuality with the Black Country, which will help Shropshire build on its strengths, counter any weaknesses, and address any future challenges alongside the Black Country authorities in accordance with MPPF paragraph 81. And we believe this requirement has been met using relevant, up-to-date evidence that is proportionate for Shropshire and also for the Black Country. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. So I think if we open the discussion up here then on requirements. So the requirement part of question 1, if that makes sense. Does anybody have anything to say on that? Mr. Brogden.
Can I just clarify how, I think it goes back to last week's, but the windfalls from memory were only assessed in terms of the SCC needs, and therefore with 30 hectares, there's no, nothing's taken into account in terms of the windfall.
We are moving on to windfall under question 1B when we get onto supply. Is that to be part? Can we move it to there, or do you think it's here?
Yeah, no, happily, as long as it's addressed. Thank you.
Fine. Okay. So taking the second part of question 1 then, the question is, what is the revised approach to employment land supply set out in the topic paper? And I think before we deal with that, we need to start with question 1A, which was a new one on the agenda in relation to the site in Shropshire mentioned at the beginning. So question 1A says, what are the implications for the employment land supply of the council's addendum to their Matterfall statement and the revised statement of common ground with Historic England regarding employment site SHR 166? So obviously the soundness of that particular proposed allocation, that will be considered under matter 16 when we get onto the employment allocations, but the implications for employment land supply really need to be considered here. So on that, can the council just talk us through the implications of new approach to a SHR 166?
The council is proposing that SHR 166 be deleted from the plan. The implications of that are that our supply would lose the site area at 45 hectares, and so our supply would fall from 413 hectares to 368. This would still put us 48 hectares above the requirement at 320. And therefore the council is confident that we can still deliver the requirement. A very simple, logical view of that would be, whilst the loss of SHR 166 at 45 hectares is significant, then our remaining oversupply of 48 hectares must be equally significant, and the council is happy to rest on that oversupply.
Thank you. So, Mr. Munro.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, this matter came up following the addendum statement that so obviously we've not had a chance to submit written comments on this. So what I am reading out will be fairly fresh in respect of it's effectively a rebuttal to that addendum.
Oh, that's the case for everybody, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Timing, yeah.
Absolutely, but just obviously to touch upon the point, there may well be things that are raised that we haven't brought up before, but you can deal with them obviously in the round.
And just to be clear, we're not taking any sort of process or procedural or even substantive point on that basis. We quite understand that this has come somewhat out of left field and that this is the place to deal with it rather than try and submit late stuff in writing or whatever.
Yeah, no, thank you. As I say, we did actually request to submit a statement, but we understand that verbal address is probably the best forum for this. I mean, obviously, the answer to question 1A is implications of the deletion of a 45 hectare allocation, which is the largest in the Regulation 19 plan, and for the Shrewsbury Place plan in particular, but also extension Shropshire wide are significant. And then the answer to 1B, in short, is that there will now clearly be a greater reliance on windfall sites at the town in particular, an approach that, as I'll explain, is contrary to the council's own strategy and unsound on the basis it's not effective. The submission draft of the local plan sought to meet an overall need of 300 hectares of employment land, obviously uplifted to 320. We are completely comfortable with that approach in terms of the housing target. But within that, there is a retained figure of 100 hectare requirement at Shrewsbury. With the uplift, obviously, there's a greater expectation that that will be delivered to help meet the higher employment land requirement. To turn to policy S16.1, and I think that's from memory, the Shrewsbury Place plan area, the development strategy of Shrewsbury states, and I'll quote, Shrewsbury is the strategic centre of Shropshire and primary focus for new development in the county. Recognising this role, building upon the priority established in the Big Town Plan to achieve balanced growth between 2016 and 2038, around 8,625 dwellings will be delivered and 100 hectares of employment land will be made available. New housing and employment will make provision for the needs of the town and surrounding hinterland, including attracting inward investment and allowing existing businesses to expand. So obviously, to reiterate, the 100 hectares is literally a policy requirement for the town, and the achievement of it will obviously provide both a quantitative and qualitative role in ensuring the economic needs of both Shrewsbury but also Shropshire as its single strategic centre are met. The 100 hectare requirements also reiterated as the culmination of the 173 pages of analysis set out in the Council's updated housing and employment topic paper, which is summarised clearly as part of table 21.1. And explaining the way in which the Council seeks to meet this target at the town, so Shrewsbury particularly, the footnotes to the table explain. This is the footnotes to table 21.1.
In which
21 points, table 21.1 of the housing and employment update housing and employment topic paper, and it's the very, very small type below that table. I'll give you a second just to locate that. So it says the approach to settlement employment land allowances varies dependent on the role and function of the settlement in Shropshire, the nature of existing employment opportunities, and the nature of employment land supply in a settlement. Specifically, larger settlements which perform a strategic role in Shropshire include an indication of land made available for employment uses, so allocations, rather than specific development guidelines as exist in smaller settlements which perform a less strategic role. So that emphasises the importance of identifying exactly where development will go at larger centres such as Shrewsbury. In other words, the council confirms its importance for allocations. What the council now proposes at Shrewsbury specifically, and that is a need to deliver at least 40 hectares of employment land by way of windfall opportunities to meet the 100-hectare requirement. So that's obviously entirely contrary to the strategy that I've just described. So then paragraphs 16.154 and 155 of the same paper, so that's the update housing and employment topic paper, explain the blended approach to delivery at the town, with the identification of speculative windfall sites intended to top up provision rather than form the basis of it. So these paragraphs state, SHR 166, so the site that's obviously been deleted, 45 hectares of, is intended to perform a strategic employment role, so being capable of delivering a range of employment uses, including B2 and B8 uses. Flexibility to deliver the whole range of employment uses on this site has, however, subsequently been impacted by heritage considerations raised by Historic England and the designation of the site of a temporary Roman marching camp as a scheduled monument. It's acknowledged this issue is yet to be discussed fully at examination and is likely to form part of the considerations at the stage 2 hearing session. So obviously here we are. The strategy also reflects the potential development opportunities presented by the delivery of the Northwest Relief Road. It has identified there is potential for additional windfall commercial development between the development boundary and the NWRR once constructed, where appropriate access can be achieved. So obviously, first and foremost from that, note the importance of site SHR 166 as the council's former key allocation at the town. It was to meet both a qualitative and quantitative need, not just qualitative, as described by the council's Matter 4 addendum paper. Reflecting on the requirement for Shrewsbury, the proposed deletion of SHR 166 means that the only additional employment allocation at what is the single strategic centre in Shropshire is a 5-hectare site as part of the larger Mitten Oak development and will likely be delivered much later in the planned period as the residential-led urban extension grows. So there's no immediate pipeline by way of allocation. In which case, the council now presents a strategy which meets only 10% of the residual requirement of 50 hectares at the town by way of allocation, with the remaining 90% to be delivered on unidentified windfall sites. So this obviously clearly represents an overwhelming reliance in particular at Shrewsbury in particular. From this point, it is important to reiterate the council's intended delivery strategy for employment sites across Shropshire, which states larger settlements will form a strategic role in Shropshire, including an indication of land made available for employment uses rather than specific development guidelines. No longer true at Shropshire's largest and most strategic settlement. So as a contingency on how the resultant 45 hectare shortfall will be met, both the topic paper and now the council's addendum to Matter 4 place a significant level of reliance on delivery of unidentified windfall sites, which apparently would be unlocked by a currently unsecured piece of strategic infrastructure, that is the NWRR. So obviously the Matter 4 addendum specifically states that that is basically the key to further employment land coming forward. This strategy is obviously tenuous and does not get close to the assurances in respect of delivery required by the MPPF and necessary to make the plan effective, the 100 hectares to be met at the town. Just a reminder, the latest position in the NWRR is as follows. The road is currently without an up-to-date business plan and costings, with the publication of this information now delayed by the council until December this year at the earliest. Its delivery continues to be supported by the local Conservative administration in charge of Shropshire Council. However, this represents the only clear endorsement of the scheme. Conversely, it's formally opposed by the Shrewsbury and Atcham Labour Party, which is a stance that now carries increased importance following the recent installation of a Labour government. The council expects the project to be fully funded by the government based on a pledge made by the previous Conservative administration. However, the most recent meeting with the current Transport Minister, Lillian Greenwood, confirms that this remains under review with no clear funding commitment. And despite the council's own resolution to grant permission for the unfunded scheme in October 2023, a decision is yet to be issued, largely due to fundamental concerns held by the Environment Agency in respect of local water supply. So a tenuous windfall strategy, if a windfall strategy is to be relied on. So in summary then, the council is now committed to increasing its employment land requirement over the planned period to 2038 by an additional 20 hectares, whilst subsequently deleting its single largest employment allocation, the 45-hectare site SHR 166 at Shrewsbury. This presents obviously a rather odd dichotomy. More drastically, the deletion of SHR 166 punches a ginormous hole in Shrewsbury's own place plan. This is confirmed best by the Council's table 17.1 in its Marta 6 addendum, which demonstrates the identified supply for Shrewsbury is now only 60 hectares, or approximately 60% of its strategic target for the planned period. Then the contingency offered by the Council of windfall sites along the length of the NWRR to meet the needs of Shrewsbury is completely speculative, bordering on entirely fanciful. The addendum to its Marta 4 statement confidently states that employment land requirement in both Shrewsbury and across Shropshire can still be met. We suggest there's no evidence at all that either target is currently demonstrably deliverable, certainly not based upon their current strategy. For the single most important location for economic growth in Shropshire, the Shrewsbury Place Plan area, to be so dependent on windfall sites, and that's 90% of its original target, when the council has sufficient suitable land available in it to allocate and provide certainty, is both at odds with its own spatial strategy and in conflict with the test of soundness in respect of whether the plan is effective and deliverable. So turning briefly, in which case, how to remedy the issue, and obviously we're looking for constructive comments here. I mean, firstly, there's a preeminent need for alternative allocations to be identified at the town, such as that of my client's land at Battlefield Roundabout. Unlike house builders who are prepared to pursue speculative sites with longer term options, commercial operators will not hang around longer than a financial year for a site to deliver. They need certainty of supply if you want to attract that investment. And in failing this, or indeed accompanying this, I refer the inspectors to our comments made towards the initial Marta 3 statement, and I think that was dated May 2022. I think the session was June 2022, which recommends that a significant loosening of the council's employment land enabling policies, that's SB 14 in particular, is required. Otherwise, the residual windfall requirement will never be delivered. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask the
Could we just clarify before we respond? Very helpful for representatives to tell us what they want you to recommend in order to fix a problem. And there were two solutions identified there: allocate or loosen the windfall approach. Could we just be clear whether it's one or either or both of those that's being contended for?
I mean, first and foremost, our preference would be allocations, because that provides the certainty that we've said doesn't exist currently. However, an alternative approach is to, I mean, if you are to go down a line where you're comfortable for windfall sites to be relied upon, we obviously, as promoters for an employment site who have taken it through the initial rounds of pre-application, we have sought to submit an application. We understand through practical application that currently both the adopted and emerging policies are highly restrictive to allow that scale of land, that strategic scale site to come forward. Smaller sites possibly, but strategic scale opportunities are very, very difficult to deliver by way of windfall policies. So obviously allocation is a preference, but a significant loosening and inbuilt allowances to the windfall policy as a less than preferred fallback.
Okay, I'll go first. Obviously, responding a little bit on the hoof today with this, but I think it's, as we said, there's no issue from our perspective on that. I'll try and pick up a few points, and then colleagues want to indicate anything else, that will be welcome as well. So just picking up a few points there. So clearly, just in terms of what you're saying, Mr. Monroe, yes, 45 hectares is proposed for removal from the plan. Just to confirm the position with supply across the county-wide on that one, because I think it's something which came up last week, and it's just worth reiterating that does not, in our view, undermine our delivery of the proposed requirement across the county-wide on that one. Okay, so we, through the sites we've included, proposed to, from the current local plan, which we were proposing to save, and the new proposals in the new local plan, there is sufficient allocations across the county to meet the overall requirements. So I think this issue is very much a Shrewsbury specific issue. That's, I think I'm getting from Mr. Monroe's issue. So, and the issue is, yes, there is a windfall allowance for Shrewsbury now on that basis. So we lose 45 hectares of, so there will be a reliance to meet the 100 hectare local specific requirement for Shrewsbury within the plan. So that's just point of agreement really on that one. Okay. That level of reliance is, I think, as set out. I think we would agree that was, yeah. I don't think there's anything between us on that. In terms of just picking up a couple of the points which Mr. Monroe outlined, we will come on to articulate our response as well. Just to pick up a couple of points about things like the North West Shoreditch Road on this one, because I think it's important here. The council's case here is that there is a significant windfall opportunity, commercial opportunity for commercial windfall, and in fact it is unique in the plan that S16.1, which is the Shrewsbury specific policy, identifies that area of land as a specific windfall opportunity. I believe it is unique in that context of the plan because we felt as though it was appropriate and useful for the plan to point that out. Your next question may be why not allocate that land rather than that, and our response to that is that we are not in a position to undertake that because that one obviously the North West Shoreditch Road is not yet developed, and I will come on to the timeframes around that because Mr. Monroe has mentioned a few things about that, and I do want to respond. And secondly, we don't feel as though there's the sufficient clarity on site promotion in that area as yet in order for us to do that. Just in terms of the North West Shoreditch Road and the concern raised, I think, by Mr. Monroe about its delivery, just want, and we might touch upon this in the infrastructure session. It's tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow morning. That particular proposal now has outline planning. Has a resolution for approval. Okay, that was taken through that process earlier this year. We are currently at the time we are seeking the Section 106 process at the moment on that. So it's quite a large process to do because obviously there's a large amount of landowners upon the proposed road. So that's why it's taking a little while to move from resolution to approval, and that is why the business case has been put back until the end of the year in order for that process to happen. It's felt that the council feels though that's the best way around to do it. The business case needs to come post approval on that one. So there's nothing else in that apart from it's taking a little while to get through the Section 106 process on that one for fairly obvious reasons. So we would say that's a firm infrastructure commitment of the council. We have funding from the Department for Transport. We have capital funding as well, from which the council has agreed. And the business case, which will be available at the end of this year, will outline the wider costs of the proposal. And we're going through a process around that at the moment, as you would expect us to do. So, the short answer is I don't share Mr. Monroe's scepticism about the delivery of the North West Relief Road, we think actually that's one very specific area. Since we first had a discussion about this at the stage 1 hearing sessions when this was mentioned, I think things have clearly moved on with the approval process around that. The second point I wanted to make was the other angle was about the policy S13, 14, I think, which is the 13 or 14.
14 you mentioned.
14, which outlines how we expect that the wider wider employment will be delivered. And this does set out in part 6, I believe, of that policy, are proposals around assessing potential windfall proposals. So that's the bit of the policy which Mr. Monroe thinks is too restrictive. We perhaps have these an alternative view on that, to say actually we think it's a permissive policy in nature and allows the policy to respond positively to opportunities. And I think the specific bit which Mr. Monroe, I think, is concerned about, and please correct if I'm wrong, is the specific context around the end user requirement. I think that's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Monroe, but I know that I've said that.
It is SP13.
It is SP13.
Yeah.
And is it part 6? You just make sure that it's part
Yes.
6. Yes. So windfall class B employment development, and that's
Page 58 of the draft.
Page 58, yeah, and that sets out those considerations which we would consider for potential windfall development. And the last one of the considerations is for major employment development, including large scale inward investment, which probably Mr. Monroe's proposal would fall into in that context, and others as well, for a known end user or occupiers to be identified. So we believe that is a reasonable aspiration or expectation of the council in managing that process effectively, but responding to actual employment opportunity, avoiding speculative development, because ultimately that's what we need to ensure this policy I suppose manages effectively. I can't comment specifically on Mr. Monroe's scepticism about it's a chicken and an egg situation, isn't it? You need the allocation, otherwise you can't get the end user. You can't rely on a windfall policy. I mean, I'm perhaps not in the right place to respond to that, but my initial take is I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. I think that there can be, again, looking at the council's both pre-app process, which we welcome, and the PPA process, which we can enter into, we invite that and have early conversations, particularly if there is inward investment opportunity and site-specific inward investment opportunity. We would specifically seek an early conversation before a planning application on that, and the councils, both the planning department and the economic growth department, would enable that conversation. So I don't share the scepticism about the windfall policy as you set out on that one. So I'll pause for a second, because I've realised I've been speaking for a little while, and just want to make sure if anyone else wants to come in on any other points before we.
Yes, ma'am. The loss of SHR 166 is an unforeseen circumstances, so it throws the council back onto the flexibility of its plan. SP13 and SP14 work together. They haven't simply been written to resolve the unforeseen circumstance around SHR 166 and the resolution of that issue at the examination. They're there to help the council determine the offers that are made to the council through their economic growth services. So a lot of investors look towards Shropshire and they're looking to see what opportunities exist. And the council is looking to invite them and to accommodate them where they can. We feel that the policy has gone as flexible as it needs to be. We need to ensure that development that occurs here also respects the environment of the county, which we see as an economic asset. It's something that attracts investment to us. So the requirement for a known end user is one way by which the council, on behalf of the communities, can be sure that this offer is realistic and have some idea of what the offer will actually mean in terms of the development itself and the employment that's being delivered. So we, the council, would choose to rest on SP 13 section 6 as it's written, and would draw your attention to MPPF paragraph 82B and the requirements it places there on the plan in terms of building a strong and competitive economy. The Secretary of State offers us a choice, and that choice still appears to be open by ruling this examination against the 2021 MPPF. That says that the council should set criteria-based policies or actually identify strategic sites, and it should do what it can do, one or the other. So it's a choice. This council has actually done both. In the case of SHR 166, the second option in that list to identify strategic sites has failed us, unfortunately, for circumstances we couldn't foresee. But that means that we can go back to the choice within the MPPF and rely on our criteria-based policy. And as I've said, we believe that it's gone as far as it needs to be, and it's as flexible as is appropriate.
Okay, before we move on, just returning to the first bit, I will come back to you, of Mr. Munro's question was about, and it is Shrewsbury centric, appreciating that, but do you recognise there's any tension then in, sorry, I'm in the background paper, table 21.1, which is on the back page, with the footnote that Mr. Munro mentioned and the new approach. Just don't know if it'd be helpful for you to summarise. I don't know how good a job I did on that. The first point.
Yeah, no problem. I can direct you to the relevant sections. Just let me find my own notes a second. I've kind of become a bit discombobulated in that respect. Hang on. You'll probably be quicker than I am. Okay, sorry. Right. So the footnote, the specific footnote that I referred to was firstly, so sorry, and the table 21.1, which I think is the culmination of the update, so right to the very end. And then there's reference, it begins, the approach to settlement employment land allowances varies dependent on.
It's to do with the importance of Shrewsbury and help. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the point being, obviously it's a large strategic settlement, absolutely. And I think we would suggest there that it does talk about making land available on that one, and I think there's more than one way to make land available. And as you said, we would say that a strong windfall policy for that purpose, and in particular with the policy around S16, which is, as I've said, unique in the plan, in that it specifically identifies an area of land for potential future windfall commercial opportunity, that does seek to do that. We make no bones about it. The loss of SHR 166 is a negative thing for this plan and this council in that context. It's not something we have taken lightly on this context, but clearly in the context of, do we think we will meet the requirement for Shrewsbury through this policy? The answer to that is yes, we do. And we think making land available is part, a good windfall opportunities is making land available. Again, I would point, Mr. Cowden's made a good point, I think, in terms of the policy framework, paragraph 81, worth reiterating. I think that is all about setting employment land, the employment land proposals and the strategy for the plan, and it is clear. It is part 82, part B. It's the or identify sites. It's set criteria or for local plan and inward investment. So this says to me that you can attract inward investment through a windfall-based a proposal, which is what we are seeking to do for Shrewsbury.
Mr. Monroe, is there anything you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think at one point I was going to request we address is the point you've already addressed in terms of that tension. Secondly, just to clarify, Mr. Cowden referring to policy SP 30. I mean, that is of course relevant. Our Matter 3 statements are Matter 3 Round 1 statement specifically addresses SP 14, which is strategic corridors. Within that, we've set out our rationale in terms of how the current approach to windfall is less than ideal, and we have suggested some amendments to that policy. Having read through it, I think they are still relevant, and I think actually more relevant than before, based upon current circumstances. And then secondly, just to look at the actual mechanics of what Mr. West is describing. I mean, obviously we differ in terms of the deliverability of the relief road, but the matter stands is that irrespective of whether that will deliver, whether it won't deliver, the timescales. Currently, what the council are proposing to do is rely on currently as yet unidentified sites next to an as yet unidentified piece of strategic infrastructure, and even once it gets permissions, funding, there's no guarantees over timescales for delivery. So it's still highly speculative. In which case, I refer you back to our initial position. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want?
It's just worth. I just don't agree with the way Mr. Monroe is framing the North West Relief Road. I don't think it is speculative, and I think it's the resolution for approval that was made this year, I think would indicate that it is far more than a speculative proposal. So I don't agree with that. I think just a point we wanted to make here on this one, obviously, Mr. Richards said a few minutes ago, there's a couple of options which Mr. Monroe is indicating, either allocations or a more generous windfall approach. I think it could be a combination of both, and I think we have to acknowledge that as well. It could be both on that one, and I think again the council happy to have a conversation about that. And of course, if there is a concern about the windfall policy as is, we would be happy to. Our position is we think it's a permissive and generous policy that responds effectively to the economic market and opportunity. If there's concern about that and you felt as though that policy needed amending, we would obviously be open to considering that as part of the picture. So I just wanted to make that.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm not sure whether the points I want to make are correctly placed where we are. I'm not making points specifically on SHR 166. But I just wanted to underline points made generally on employment land on the divergence in the figures. Whether this is the correct place, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we've dealt with requirement. We're on to supply. The next questions, there's one specifically about windfall and then one specifically about the Black Country. So if you...
I just wanted to make points generally on need and supply, which is how metaphor is framed, and requirement, which has been omitted from the framing of metaphor. Actually,
so requirement and supply are in question 1, which we are kind of still in.
Well,
so I think that's fine.
Okay, thank you. So I tell you, our submissions have pointed to the anomalies in the employment land figures, and the Economic Development Needs Assessment of December 2020, the EDNA, stated the objectively assessed need as being recommended that Shropshire's employment land objectively assessed need should comprise a range of between 132 hectares to 234 hectares between 2016 to 2038. And just point out that that range is a long way short of the stated requirement, currently stated to be 320 hectares. Then the settlement guidelines, the requirement, again a requirement, settlement guidelines are stated as numbers that are around a certain quantum. And as we pointed out, that adds up to 375 hectares, which is considerably higher than the requirement of 320 hectares. Moving on to supply, the supply is now stated to be 413 hectares, according to that paragraph that's been pointed out before, 17.1 of GC 45. That itself, as I understand it, is based on the authority monitoring report to 31st March 2020, which, although 4 years old, is the latest AMR available. The figure actually reported in that report is actually 405 hectares, not 413 hectares as quoted. The upshot is that the stated supply of 413 hectares is some 76% higher than the maximum stated need figure of 234 hectares. And remember, that was stated as a range. For 234 hectares is the top end of that range. So the question left hanging is, has this slight hodgepodge of figures been brought together into a sound position? That's all we're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Council like to respond on that?
Well, in the employment topic papers, we explain how we move from the figures in the EDNA to the need figure that we've used to determine the employment land requirement. In essence, the need figure in the EDNA used a 40% plot density, so it assumed a high density. The council's evidence, which the authors of the EDNA have directed the council to in terms of the information it's provided, the council's evidence suggested that we were delivering a much lower density overall. If we were to proceed with the figures that were in the EDNA, delivering much lower densities, then we would undersupply to the needs of the county. And so an adjustment was made to the EDNA figures, and that took us to, on the Experian baseline forecast, which is what underlines our need, that took us to a figure of 250 hectares. So it was a density adjustment. In terms of the settlement guidelines, the settlement guideline figures were determined very early in the process. So they're contained within EV 004, which was the preferred scale and distribution of development. They were determined as guide figures for the work that then came on the preferred sites, and the Regulation 18 plan. Discovering that they were higher, the council chose to leave them where they were rather than bring them down. If they were to bring them down, the fear was that in decision making later in the plan period, the lower settlement guidelines might lead to otherwise acceptable development being refused on the basis that we'd hit that settlement guideline. So we left them high, and we felt that that would enable our then policy of achieving around 300 hectares to operate more freely. It would now appear that moving to a minimum, where there's an assumption that we will go ahead, removing those settlement guidelines as a bar to the decision-making process now appears good sense to the council. In terms of the supply, at the outset, we did have a supply of 405 hectares. That was using evidence that was available to us early in the process. We subsequently updated our monitoring and found that the supply had moved upwards from 405 to 413. And so we're merely reflecting the development of our evidence base.
For my moment, it's just a point which Mr. Calvin raised there as well, and it's just worth reiterating, I think, because it came up last week in the context of the settlement guidelines in connection to the housing requirement, the difference between minimum and around. And I think we came to a sort of an agreement that it was still appropriate to frame the settlement specific guidelines as an around figure, but the county-wide level being a minimum. I think that was, and I think that's our continued proposal, including on the employment land as well. It's just a.
Okay, anything else, Mr. Green, or well, in response, not anything new?
I'd only point out the difference of approach with the employment figures and the housing figures, that the settlement guidelines on housing do not exceed the overall requirement for the county. They do for employment land.
Would you like to respond on that specific point?
Yes, ma'am. The intention with employment is that we don't turn away investment that will assist the council's objective of delivering a step change. There's always the possibility that with settlement guidelines that exactly meet the employment requirement, the decision makers assume that the figures are a limit. And looking to the AMR, they feel that they have sufficient evidence from that to moot a refusal, whereas the council and the communities of Shropshire will benefit from an approval. So we've taken a slightly different approach on settlement guidelines for employment, because we still want to continue to encourage investment and new development. And that will enable SP 13 and SP 14 to also work more effectively.
Yeah.
Just to expand on my colleague Mr. Calvin's point, with regard to housing, obviously last week we spoke about SP 7, the Managing Housing Development Policy, which recognises and identifies the process that decision makers take in circumstances where the residential development guidelines for settlements either appear likely to be exceeded or undelivered. Effectively, the council considers there is a distinction in terms of how housing and employment comes forward in the county, and our approach in the plan seeks to reflect and respond to the distinction in those two markets.
Nearly missed Mr. Harrop.
Thank you, ma'am. As with Mr. Green, my point is reference supply. It may or may not be appropriate, but I'll point you to the Shropshire Employment Land Review 2019 that was carried out by Avison Young, commissioned by Shropshire Council. In particular, it's referring to Opportunity Area 3. Some of the sites in Opportunity Area 3 are in existing use for industrial storage, or are in a dilapidated condition and not fit for purpose, and therefore provide a regeneration stroke redevelopment opportunity. The land situated around these sites, namely SHIP 18A, P14, SHIP 18B, and SHIP 18D, has been promoted through the local plan process. These sites could represent an extension to the existing business area at Lamledge Estate and providing an opportunity for larger employment offering, which would be attractive to local companies. They could also address the current shortfall in the employment land supply in the town and stimulate regeneration stroke redevelopment of the existing employment site. That's my point.
Okay, I think we might be moving on to that.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm on and off.
Well, forgive me if it wasn't the
fine, but
right
it might be that under question 2. Just, well, I won't put words in your mouth, but have a look at question 2 and see if you think that is.
Yeah, I just think my misinterpretation is reference to supply. So
No,
I apologise for that.
Yeah, they're not clean
Okay.
sort of compartments where we can leave everything. Sadly.
Right. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
So that was question 1A.
Where I could get my foot in on it.
Oh,
I don't quite know where to put it at the moment.
No.
I'm grateful that there's somebody else in the same boat.
well, shall we do it now? If
What I was going to ask was, just where do you want that, or whether you want them or not, where would you like to hear them? Comments that sorry. This session has got off talking about the overall employment supply, and when we get down to place plans, the topics that are listed under place plans are to do with specific sites. There seems to me to be a stage in between there when you're talking about the distribution of that overall number to various settlements. And you'll know that I spoke about Bridge North when we were talking about the sustainability appraisal. A large employment allocation has been given to Bridge North, and I did want to make some comments about that. But we seem to be talking about Shrewsbury and site. So,
well, we were talking about Shrewsbury because Mr. Munro's points were about that, which tells me that this session has now moved into areas about place planning. So I think it's fine for you to make your comments about if they're to do with the place plans here.
and then, sorry, I've got a comment on behalf of him, Mr. Maiden, about employment in rural areas, because the rural areas do not seem to be spoken about a great deal.
I think we can do those now. Yeah.
Can we?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. I was saving them to the one that talks about the number of people and employment plan, but I'll deal with it all now if that's all right.
You were thinking it sat under question.
Well,
3?
it's a point in both instances about aligning housing allocations with employment allocations. And they don't always seem to run together. And in some cases, like Bridge North, there's a big allocation for housing, but a greater allocation for employment. And the balance between those doesn't seem particularly clear. In the housing and employment topic paper, it says, aligning employment and housing growth means identifying suitable opportunities for growth in the future labour supply. And I can't grasp where that has taken place.
So I am conscious that we did cover some of this under matter 1 last week about SA, and then again in matter 2 about spatial strategy. So if it's a repeat, we've heard everything that was said, and I think you were here for matter 2
and
matter 1. Yeah. So if it's, rest assured those points are taken.
Yes, I wasn't going to go through the sustainability appraisal again, I can promise you that.
So if it's points about the generality of this is employment requirement and then supply. So if we can stick.
There was a generality of the manner in which Bridge North, in one case, has been allocated, the housing it's been allocated, and the employment that has been allocated, and the percentages, if you like, of those two seem at odds.
Just we talked about this on Thursday as well. I think we talked about the balance of employment land and housing land.
Well, I thought that was all to do with housing. That's why I wasn't here on Thursday.
Yeah, there was a question on there, as I recall, but I've had a weekend between, but I think I recall that was.
I mean, I was going on to ask whether this should be covered in the place plan submissions or in matter 26 with talking about the actual employment allocations. But again, that's down to site issues rather than
difficult without knowing what you want to say. But if it was about the spatial strategy, I think we've heard it. If it's about specific things to do with employment requirement or employment supply, then it's today. And then yes, totally agreed. We will be going on to this in the place plan areas and employment sites.
Well, if I start and you think I'm going too far in any direction, I'm sure you'll tell me, and I promise to shut up at that point. Right. This is. I'm choosing me things now. This is for the Save Bridge North Greenbelt people. There's no argument with the overall figures that you've got in front of you. 31,300 houses for the county, 320 hectares. So no argument with that. But Bridge North has been allocated 1,800 houses and 49 hectares of employment land. And that's a lot of employment land compared with the housing allocation. We don't know why that has taken place. And I think this is a matter of strategy because it runs through everything. And the history of employment development in Bridge North, or the recent history, wouldn't support a huge employment allocation because there hasn't been that much development. In fact, there hasn't been much housing development either. I didn't work out the possible number of people that might be employed. I did it by comparing or calculating 1 hectare per X number of houses. And what we saw in Bridge North was that 1 hectare of employment land was being allocated for 36.7 dwellings. Now, if you take a look at the overall figures, 31,300 and 320 hectares, you get a figure of 1 hectare 98 houses. And there doesn't seem to be an explanation as to why Bridge North should take a greater proportion of employment land compared with the amount of housing they've got. Now, if it was that there'd been a big surge in employment development in Bridge North over the recent past, that might be a reason for it, but there hasn't been. In the SAMDEV plan, I'm sorry to take you back to that, but Bridge North was allocated 500 dwellings, and that was on two main sites, and there were 3 employment sites. There was 6.7 hectares. This is at Tasley. 6.6 hectares, again at Tasley. But that was to do with the relocation of the livestock market. And then one site of 1.5 hectares at Old Worcester Road. Now, none of those sites has so far come forward. Neither the housing nor the employment. The fact that neither has come forward doesn't give you any great confidence that an even greater allocation is going to come forward in the future. There's been a recent consent, a sort of joint outline and full planning permission, which is a weird way of doing it as far as I could see, for 550 houses with a food store, hotel, public house and a load of other things on those 2 sites that I've just mentioned, the 2 SAMDEV residential sites. And the permission included the employment land as an outline permission, even though it was shown as being a full permission. There were no details of it at all. That has moved forward as far as the housing is concerned, because there are now reserved matters applications in as far as the housing land is concerned, but there's still no detail at all about the employment land. Now that again doesn't suggest that there's any great need or demand for employment land in Bridge North. And yet we've got this whopping great big allocation. In the current local plan, the SAMDEV, there was a preferred options consultation. In the current review, the preferred sites consultation document of November 2018, they calculated that the preferred employment land guidance for this plan, but this was only going up to 2036. They hadn't put the extra couple of years in there, was 16 hectares. Now, at that time, the council believed there was an imbalance in Bridge North between housing and employment. Also at that time, the council were proposing a new village at Stanmore. Now, the new village had got an allocation for 16 hectares of employment land. So very much it was in line with the preferred option guidance. As the review progressed, the council decided the site at Tasley for a new village was preferable. And then allocated 16 hectares of employment land to the Tasley site. So the 16 hectares that was originally proposed for Stanmore has now gone down to Tasley. It's still 16 hectares and it's still in Bridge North. So the original necessity for 16 hectares has been catered for. Now, if you add up the amounts of land that are now proposed for development and you get to 49, you begin, I think, to wonder what's the sudden jump. I know it takes into account the SAMDEV allocations, which have not been delivered yet. But how you get from 16 and 12, whatever, to 49 is a big jump. And it doesn't seem to be justified anywhere. So that was the basis of this, really, that this is a strategy that must, I mean, I'm dealing with Bridge North, but it must be taking place all over the county.
Okay, can I ask the council to respond just on that specifically before we move?
I think it's a bit of a general point as well. I think that's in nowhere Mr. Roberts is heading with his arguments here, but the S3 policy S3 in the plan is Bridge North. That sets out the proposed role of Bridge North, not only to take into account the role and nature of Bridge North, but its strategic role in the east of Shropshire. Okay, so there's a wider context there. In terms of the quantum of employment growth, it is 49 hectares which we are making available or proposing to make available to create competition in the market, as choice and competition in the market. That's specifically what the policy is there to do. So we'd make that land available through allocations in this context, not specifically through windfall. And Mr. Roberts gave quite a nice overview of how we got to where we got to, really, with the Tasley Garden Village, which is not where we began the process way back when, but it's where we are now. And that was primarily because of an alternative option which came forward relatively late in the day, and which obviously this council sought to prefer. That came with it an opportunity, a balanced garden village proposal for over 1,000 dwellings plus the 16 hectares of employment land. That's what the proposal was from the site promoter at that point. So we worked with the site promoter. So it was responding to an opportunity on that context. So the way that policy is framed is all about utilising that opportunity for employment land as well as the residential in that area to support a balanced and effective and sustainable garden village proposal. The site which I think Mr. Roberts is concerned about, or the two sites Mr. Roberts is concerned about, are the proposals on the east of the town, where we are proposing that land is removed from the green belt. That is on the basis of and again, utilising an opportunity around the expansion and the need for expansion of the Stanmore employment area. And I could go into the ins and outs of the exceptional circumstances now, but it's probably not the place unless you wanted us to. But basically, that's why you've arrived at where we've arrived at. It's two distinct options for the town. The town proposes and includes a strategic role in the east of the county. And there are distinct opportunities which we are looking to utilise to make that land available for competition and choice in the market.
Thank you. You had a second point with a different hat on, I think. Yeah. About Bridge North, more general, of course, yeah.
I'll be returning to this when we get to the place plans session, and also when we get to the site allocations. Because I think the council have not taken into account the age structure that exists now in Bridge North. We'll get onto that, and the type of employment that actually takes place and the commuting, the manner in which commuting takes place there. And the other one is, you'll be pleased to know, quite quick. This is to do with a village called Hinstock, but again, I think it's a matter of strategy because this must be happening in loads of villages. Hinstock has been noted as a community hub, and I'm just wondering where the employment for development in community hubs is actually meant to take place. In SP2, it says at point 6, recognising the rurality of much of Shropshire and the importance of ensuring the long-term sustainability of your rural communities, growth in urban areas will be complemented by appropriate new development than community hubs. It doesn't actually say employment development, but I think that's what it's hinting at. And then it talks about where there is evidence to local needs and appropriate rural employment and economic diversification. Now, if you go on to take a look at what that actually means when it gets down to, if I can find my place, it'd be helpful, wouldn't it? When it gets down to a community hub, and Hinstock is being christened a community hub, there's going to be 155 dwellings allocated to Hinstock. And in the hierarchy of settlements document, it says that Hinstock, at that point in time, I think it's a few more now because in the last SAMDEV plan, there were quite substantial housing developments in Hinstock. I think it got 850, somewhere like that, houses. No, I'm wrong. It was 314. So this is a big increase in housing. And it's the same point, really, as the first one, aligning housing with employment. So there's a near doubling of the housing to go in Hinstock, and then at S11.2.3, it says within these community hubs, because there are more than one in the Market Drayton area, new employment development will be delivered through appropriate small-scale windfall employment development within the settlement's development boundary. And I think that's the way it goes for pretty well all of the community hubs in the area. It does seem to me that the result of this is going to be commuter villages rather than villages that can actually be sustained within themselves. If you're going to put 155 dwellings in a village, you must expect them to work somewhere. And there doesn't seem to be any positive allocations around hubs to provide that employment by saying that the development has got to take place within development boundaries. That makes life even more difficult because people in villages quite often do not want a small employer next to them. And I won't go through the other policies, but it does seem that council are again clinging to this idea that the rural area is governed by agriculture and the people who live there aren't nowadays mainly employed in agriculture. It's a different situation altogether. And most of those 155 dwellings will provide commuter traffic. Yeah, I think you've got the point, Matt.
Okay, thank you. Would the council like to respond on any of those points?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Just dealing with the Hinstock point, obviously we do feel as though we do make land available through a windfall approach in the countryside. We do not specifically propose allocations in community hubs for employment purposes. I believe that's right across the board. Yes, that is right across the board. We feel that's in line with our spatial approach of seeking to develop out urban areas and develop those opportunities. However, as was pointed out again in the context of residential, but the same applies for employment. We are a rural county. We do like to have a positive framework for a permissive approach to the right types of employment development, either in community hubs or in the countryside. And our strategic policies, SP8, which is managing development in community hubs, specifically references employment development. That's a G on that one, so type G. So cumulative any employment development and other non-residential development in combination with completions since the start of the plan period is considered appropriate and completion in size, scale and identity of the settlement. So we set out the policy framework for how the decision maker in that context would make that decision in terms of an employment opportunity. And yes, and the second part of that development proposal outside the boundary of community hubs will be measured in accordance with SP number 10, words out, and that is managing development in the countryside. And if we go to that, there is a very clear policy framework around how we would seek to encourage small scale new economic proposals in areas of the countryside. So I think we would argue that we have a very positive windfall approach for new employment development of the right scale in more rural areas of Shropshire, including community hubs. Just in terms of a numerical issue, just to make that point, there are any employment development which happens in these areas is as well as the wider supply that we've been having a discussion about this morning. So it's not factored into that overall county-wide. It's as well as, because we don't yet know when that will happen. We think it will happen because that's what Shropshire tends to do, but we haven't specifically captured that in our overall supply to meet the requirement.
Thank you. Okay, fine. Don't think there's anybody else on this specific question. So I think if we, oh, sorry, Mr. Green, missed that.
Only a quick point. We ended in before the break. Mr. Roberts has mentioned the balance between housing and employment, particularly how the effect on rural areas. I just wanted to put down a reminder of how originally there was a balance between housing and employment, and the employment figures guidelines for settlements were calculated pretty much by a formula, which was that one house provided one employee required 42.25 square meters of space on average for an employment. The employment land required to provide that 42.25 square meters was 40% greater than that. And if you divide that by 10,000 by the time you get there, you arrive at the hectareage of employment land. And I just to get a feel for that, we produced this schedule, which is in our submission, which I think is BA127. And it's Appendix 4A and 4B. but that clearly identifies the residential development guideline and the associated employment land guideline for all the main settlements. A lot of those, the employment guideline is still based on that calculation I've just set out. It isn't based on that, particularly for Bridge North, Shifnal, and one or two other settlements. Mr. Cowden has mentioned in the housing and employment topic paper that they may have realised that the 40% grossing up may not be correct. The AMR produces figures which suggest that 25% is a more realistic present day figure. They haven't, however, adjusted that in the settlement guidelines for the minor settlements. I should just say on the schedule I've drawn your attention to, we've incorrectly said that it's based on GC 44. It should be based on GC 45, of course. In the inquiry speak, that would be a minor modification. Proofreading. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Would the council like to respond on any of those points? Or
I don't think that there's anything we particularly want to say at this point on that.
that's fine, thank you. Then I think we should break here. It's just gone 11. If we can be back at 20 past 11, that should give everyone time to do what they need to do. Thank you. I think if everyone looks to be here, if we can resume. So I think we may have dealt with question 1A, or we may have strayed into others, or we may not have entirely covered it. But I think if we move on to question 1B, which concerns windfalls, and then if anybody's got anything after we've dealt with the other questions, I'll ask at the end for general comments on employment requirement and supply that we haven't picked up through trying to speak to the agenda. So question 1B is there a greater requirement on windfall sites to meet the revised employment requirement? And if so, is this approach sound? So we did cover this last week to some degree. So would you like to?
Yes, I think we did cover it actually, and the same. Well, both from an employment perspective, and I think in the general principle around the residential side as well. So I think just to reiterate the point really here is that I think there is a distinction between known windfall and non-known windfall. So we got into that rather interesting discussion last week. I think we might have been making new things up in the planning glossary, but it's effectively trying to articulate that there are when we've looked at our commitments, a lot of those have been windfall proposals. So we count those as windfall because they are included in the definition in the framework. So they are known windfall because they are completions, they're approved, and in some instances have been completed. Looking at the unknown windfall, there is our position is there is no requirement on unknown windfall, the remainder of the plan, to meet the overall employment requirement for the county. That's our position, and I think we've articulated that in 17.1 of the matter for a addendum, which we submitted into the examination a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, we recognise, as we discussed this morning, there are settlement-specific issues for Shrewsbury in particular, where there is reliance on unknown windfall to meet the settlement-specific guideline in that area. But the county-wide, which I think that's your question in this context, is county-wide. The answer is no, there's not, and yes, it's sound in our view.
So just a quick question before I open up, in terms of the known and the unknown, which I would also anticipate we might be going there. So are there any, in terms of known windfalls for employment, in the same way that the known windfalls for housing are set out in the topic paper and there's a table? I think that's 8.5. Yeah, is there a table somewhere for employment that is there a table somewhere for employment? I'll leave it there.
There is not. I don't think unless I'm kicked. No, there's not. But the reason why there isn't is because, as I've said, we are not reliant upon windfall to meet the overall count. So we felt as though there was no need to present compelling evidence on that, because we don't need it for the overall in meeting the county-wide requirement. In terms of the Shrewsbury specific point, obviously we mentioned that ahead of the break, and we would point to opportunities identified through 16.1, policy 16.1, around identifying land between the proposed Northwest Relief Road and the development boundary of Shrewsbury as a potential opportunity for future unknown windfall in that settlement. But that's always been the case in terms of that policy.
Just to be clear, in table 17.1 of the council's addendum to our matter 4 statement, the only windfall in that are sites with planning permission that have either been completed or are committed because of that planning permission. So that's the distinction between housing and employment, where in housing we have a specific windfall allowance and we've identified potential sites that could contribute to achieving that allowance. For employment, the only reliance on windfall is where it benefits from planning permission.
Thank you. That helps. That helps me. Mr. Munro.
It's purely for the avoidance of doubt. We don't have anything more to add, but in terms of my initial response, that's kind of covered a combination of 1A and 1B.
That's fine. It's largely inevitable. Yeah. Mr. Kells, I think, had his just before yours. No, it's fine. Everyone will speak.
Yes, ma'am. I think I did a very general point, and it goes between this and the initial point that we made about we can call it the generosity of the employment land requirement. We consider it a generous requirement, and I did refer you back, and it might be worth just looking at it very briefly. Last week, I referred you back to the original economic development EV 43, the original development, the economic needs assessment, and we included in our latest response the graph that's given of the. Sorry, I've moved my cursor and got to the wrong place. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I've my fault for being relying on these machines. Yeah, we did in paragraph 8.91 of EV 43. There is a table which sets out the various ways of working out the requirement, which then goes into figure 8.3, which I think we reproduced in our response. But it shows the various path take-up rates, experience, regeneration. I'm sure you've looked at it. But the point I wanted to come back to on that, in terms of the generosity which comes into the windfall, is that the employment land requirement is really broken down into the net requirement, a significant flexibility factor, which is to allow choice, quite rightly, and then a significant amount of loss replacement. And the economic development paper goes into some detail as to how that loss replacement was based on historic loss of employment land. And we know from what we discussed last week that the council anticipates at least some of that will be churned back because sites will become available because they will have been in a use for employment, they'll be out of date, they'll be knocked down, and someone will build a new employment site on it. It won't all end up as housing. So the windfalls will play an important role in that regard through churn. So we consider there is a very generous employment land requirement in general terms, accepting that a very specific issue for the larger sites, and you've heard about that with the Shrewsbury site. We also have, in terms of windfalls, significant additional windfalls, which are not, we have a supply which is above that, including these kind of churn windfalls. We then have significant windfalls above that because in GC 45, in our table 15.1, which is the guidance, we have some 33 hectares which are going to aim to produce in these various places. Bridge North was mentioned. Now, I think I'm right from what we heard last week that 33 hectares is not on land within the 413. It's a different process. So the significant windfalls there. We've also heard in Shrewsbury that there is a significant windfall along the Northwest Relief Road, and I don't want to rehearse whether that will happen or not, but you just need to understand that obviously if that happens, then that is a very significant addition above the generous allowance we've already got to meet overall employment needs, not going into the particular Shrewsbury. But that gives us an extremely generous, as we see it, allowance. And we think that those windfalls are very likely to come forward, certainly the reuse of employment land, with a commitment on these. Now, one of the questions, just to finish, is that one of the things that's been asked of us by the council is what does this mean for the plan? And I can see Mr. Richards thinking, well, this is all very good about the number, then it's an interesting point, but what is CPRE saying? And we haven't looked at specific areas in detail to the same degree as others, but I think there are 3 points that come out of it. The first one is that being a generous allowance, if you're looking at sites more specifically, which others know much more about than us, we consider that there is opportunity to reduce the number of allocated sites if there are other reasons, other environmental, countryside reasons, or whatever. There is leeway, is as far as we want to go. It also had implications for the Shirehall site, but I will come back to that when we come to the Black Country, and also for jobs, and I'll come back to that on matter 3.
Thank you. Council, like to respond on any of those points? Did start to look at the differences between table 15.1 and table 17.1 last week, and I think we agreed to park it for today, so this might be the juncture.
All 15.1 does is it looks at the settlement guidelines, which, as we said earlier, were set quite high in order not to cause any problems with the delivery of investment, compares those settlement guidelines with the land supply, and it gives us a theoretical maximum. Now, our employment requirement is 320. Our supply now sits at 368. The guidelines would take us to 375. So, as I say, it is theoretical. We are not going to get there. It is a significant overstretch for Shropshire above a requirement of 320, which is aspirational. Our AMR and its monitoring of delivery rates to date would indicate that that position is true.
Specifically on the 33 windfall in that table, I think that's where Mr. Kells was with it.
We don't expect that will be delivered because that is 33 above a supply of 357. So the supply itself is just there to enable the employment requirement at 320 to be delivered. So the supply, so the windfall allowance exceeds the supply, and the supply exceeds the requirement. And it's the requirement that we're aiming for, which is itself an aspirational target.
I think to avoid any confusion with this, with the table, I think effectively it's where we've identified where there's windfall capability within the table. It's literally the difference between the guideline and urban supply on that one. I think I would actually say that I'm not entirely sure how helpful that is if for your purposes in this context. I think it was us trying to do a bit of maths here, which may have ended up slightly confusing the matter. That's not compelling evidence to suggest there's a need for a windfall allowance. It's just trying to say there's a difference between all the guidelines put together and the urban supply. So the context is there will be windfall development, but I wouldn't take too much attention to that in context of the wider question you're asking at the moment, I would suggest.
So they're not intended to be, well, obviously they're different from, but they're not intended to be over and above anything reported in table 17.1. It's just a different way of expressing it.
It's a different way, exactly.
Right.
No.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. I'm sorry.
And they're not intended to be an expression of unknown windfalls.
No, they're not. I think it's the council trying to be helpful and not succeeding.
Mr. Kells.
Sorry, that confuses me in one way, and I may be asking a question that I can imagine the people in those centres will be asking. So I apologise, but in that case, what is the status of this? For example, extra 10. Is it something the council is aiming for? Is it something they're positively encouraging developers to do? You know, is it that, or if it's this theoretical number and you put it in as a number, then surely someone is going to come along and say, well, I want to do my site, and that's, you know, is it just a theoretical thing, or is it something where the council wants it to happen and will encourage it to happen, and people should take a view on it one way or another? Because that reply has left me thinking, what is a theoretical number about when we're talking about a plan or a place? I hope that's not going beyond my remit, but that confuses me.
Would you like to reply just on that point?
What table 15.1 tells me is that each urban settlement has a settlement guideline for employment land. And then the table also tells me what land supply the council has identified for those settlements, each of those settlements. And then the last table is a piece of maths. So 57, in the case of Oswestry, 57 minus 47 is 10. In the case of Bridgenorth, 49 minus 39 is 10, and so on and so forth. If you want to know whether or not that windfall capacity is being encouraged or not, then you need to read the policies that deal with settlement guidelines.
But again, it's just worth reiterating, because I don't want people to leave the room today with confusion around this. There's no reliance on that unknown windfall to meet the overall employment requirements. I mean, I agree with Mr. Kells. This is a generous approach. In fact, we say that.
Yeah.
In fact, we were quite explicit about that, and it's not on purpose.
The word generous appears on the page with table 15.1 on more than one occasion.
So we would tend to agree with some of the point. Obviously, we're coming from different angles on the conclusion of that. It is not unusual, I think, for councils and local plans to take that positive. I think generous is perhaps the wrong word, really. Positive approach, I think, I would prefer to say, approach to employment supply in order to achieve a suitably flexible supply in meeting the overall requirements. We all know, I think, and Shropshire is much like other counties like us, it is harder to develop employment land than it is to develop residential land, and hence why I think there is a need to identify a generous supply of employment land in order to achieve that.
Thank you. Mr. Green, is it on a separate point? I'm conscious that we can't have two speakers from the same place on the same thing.
It's just further the same point, really, that it's been the council have indicated that table 15.1 is just a mathematical exercise, really, that the windfall capability column is just the balance of the two columns to the left. They haven't shown where the middle column exceeds the column to the left. I would just make
okay,
the point.
So this is, I need, it's one or the other. Mr. Kell's had the chance really to make these points.
May I continue? I mean, the point really is that exactly the same applies to the housing figures as well, that the windfall column on the housing numbers is also just a balancing figure. And their tables equally don't show where it could be considered to be a negative figure. So the allocations could be reduced.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything on that? Oh, no.
No.
Okay, Mr. Brogden.
Sorry, thank you. A couple of points if I may. First is, if I've understood the discussion this morning properly, before we talk about windfall sites, there's a significant oversupply of employment land, and I wasn't quite clear from this morning's conversation what that number was, but it seems to be about 60 hectares over and above the 320, which was, I think, described as aspirational. And I appreciate that's a broad sort of figure, but I wasn't quite clear where the numbers were. But it's whether the word is generous or not. I mean, that is a significant oversupply, and that's before you consider the issue of windfall sites, which don't think have been taken into account at all certainly for Bridgnorth and Shifnal, because that came out this morning. But they appear to have now been taken into account for Shrewsbury. And forgive me, it's either a 60% windfall or 40% windfall. Of my notes, I wrote down 40%. I couldn't remember which way around it was. So but either way, Shrewsbury, because of an identified problem, have relied upon a significant windfall allocation. That approach strikes me as very, very inconsistent. And if you were going to adopt a windfall approach, then it should be across the county. And if that was then adopted, the number of allocated sites should reduce quite significantly to be logical. And so there seems to be an approach which is not logical. And also, following on from last week's conversation, the approach for employment land and residential land appears to be at odds with each other. I'm not sure how and why that should be the case. If a windfall analysis is to be taken into account, it should be across the board, both employment and residential and across the county. And that strikes me as logical because that demonstrates what's happened historically. Windfall sites do appear. So to suddenly put the blinkers on certain locations or certain types of assets seems illogical. And that's my main point.
Thank you. Be glad to respond.
Yes, ma'am. I think we touched upon this last week, and we were thinking with the consistency of windfall approach between either whether it's county-wide approach or settlement specific, and in effect, it's the same response in the fact that Shropshire Council is a very large area, and it has lots of settlements, and it has urban areas, and it has a significant amount of rural areas as well, and you can tell that from the settlement hierarchy, with Shrewsbury, the principal centres, key centres, community hubs, community clusters, and rural area. So there's a lot happening in Shropshire in terms of a settlement hierarchy, and we feel as though the approach that we've taken both in the current plan and proposed in this plan is to apply that finer grain of consideration at the settlement specific level in order to identify one and utilise opportunity in those areas as well. I don't think a county-wide windfall approach, consistent approach, one size. For all, it kind of is effectively your proposal. I don't think that fits within the Shropshire context. It may in some areas, but I don't think it's effective planning for Shropshire. I don't think I've got anything more to say on that point, just really a wider point.
Mr. Rodden, do you have anything else? No? Okay. Okay, so that looks like everybody on question 1B. I'm just going to check mine before we move on. No, that's fine. So if we move to question 2, which is what provision is made within the plan to fulfil the identified unmet employment needs of the Black Country, and will the plan's approach be effective in addressing the sustainably within the plan period in accordance with national policy? I think it'd be helpful if we have been over this, but if we could just outline the approach to identifying Shirehall and why that's considered to be in the right place, that would help.
So the council has identified 30 hectare contribution towards the Black Country. It's considered in the SA reasonable alternatives, looking at Shrewsbury and the east of the county. It's looked at the capacity of the towns in that area, and also looked at specific sites that could be identified in those locations. The intention is that we should meet the purposes of contributing towards the Black Country that are set out in the employment strategy topic paper in chapter 6. So building on the connectivity with the Black Country and building on the functional relationships, and also looking at how we might best support the Black Country to deal not only with their shortfall in land supply, but also ensure, on the advice of the examining authority at the West Mids Interchange, that they should still be able to meet their own needs, and that particularly businesses should still be able to access labour. So we want to help them, and we want to help them in a mutually supportive way. Taking all of those factors into account, our assessment of the reasonable alternatives led us to Shirehall, because that was the settlement and the specific sites that met those objectives.
Thank you. Just got one question before we move it on. So we touched on this last week as well, but just for my benefit. So the West Midlands Strategic Employment Site Study, and we did hear about the timing of that in relation to the preparation of the plan. But I think a question is, now that that is available, have you got any sort of steer on what the findings of that study do in terms of supporting or not supporting the direction on Black Country needs?
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'll start and then see how may want to say something as well. It just a little bit of context. The West Midlands Employment Strategic Sites Study was a commission from it was a group of West Midlands authorities in the middle of, about the middle of last year, and in terms of Shropshire's involvement in that, and I should be quite specific about that, we were involved in that process as part of the commission, and the way the basic I suppose the brief for that was to look at the quantum of strategic employment required across the whole of the West Midlands area. Not everywhere was in scope, and there is a table which says which settlements were in scope and which were not. So there was a definition of what is the need in that area, taking into account available EDNAs in that area as well. So it wasn't trying to conflict with EDNAs, it was taking into account the various EDNAs across the board. And then utilise it and then looking at opportunity areas within that. There were no, there's no, it's quite a high level document. Identifying opportunity areas is perhaps where we want, where it was pitched. That in terms of Shropshire's inclusion within that, Shropshire was included as a potential source of supply, but not in terms of the need. So effectively, it was a reflection of the conversations which we've been having through the DTC process of there is a recognition that Shropshire has a role here, which we've talked at length about in this examination around what that is, and there may be a role in the future as well, and we're not discounting that. Now, what this is saying is there are a number of opportunity areas across the whole of the area that was in scope. One of those opportunity areas was the corridor across the M50 M54. And that has identified an opportunity area around that area. Now, I would say, in answering your question specifically, Ma'am, that I think the approach we've taken in both the original conversations with our neighbours around the DTC and now subsequently in the identification of specific land in order to cater for that is entirely in agreement with the proposals around that opportunity area in that West Midlands strategic employment site. What we are proposing is a strategic employment opportunity. In that context, strategic employment opportunities are 20 hectares and above, 25 hectares and above, sorry, in that context. That's quite normal, I think, in terms of employment land. So I would say our proposals for accommodating that unmet need within the area of that opportunity area on the site identified is entirely in line with the proposals in that report. We clearly didn't have that until September this year, and I know party who's not around the table today made the point, and we had a conversation last week around that, but that wasn't available for this work here. It was only published relatively recently, and it certainly wasn't available for any earlier conversations around ETC and the conversation around that, so it wasn't available around that. This is primarily a helpful tool to help West Midlands authorities work in a coordinated way in addressing inevitable unmet needs, both now and in future local plan reviews. That's the intention of it. I think that's where it's got to. So I think it's entirely consistent, our approach, with the conclusions of that proposal.
Thank you, that's helpful. I haven't interrupted your flow with, anyway.
So you carry on, madam. I was simply going to make a general point on behalf of the consortium. It's principally summarised in paragraph 2.5 of the hearing statement. But the points that we just wanted to make, and it builds on the discussion you had about the removal of SHR 166. And in terms of the general approach, you've heard a great deal about the approach being generous in terms of employment land. The position, in fact, that we say is that there needs to be more flexibility built into the council's approach to employment land supply. specifically because of the removal of those 45 hectares, and also specifically because of the need to address Black Country unmet need. Clearly, we're not objecting to the Shirehall allocations, but it's the need for more flexibility. And indeed, that is in fact supported by the study. I've heard what Mr. West has said, but that's a really important document for those very authorities that this council is seeking to cooperate with. And Madam, I will just take the opportunity again to make the point that we think you need to see the outcomes and the records of what comes out of those meetings since 2022. Just 2022, forgive me. There were, in order for you to be clear about the Black Country's position, and Madam, we say that the references and approach that's been taken within the study to Bridge North, and in particular our area of Bridge North, needs to be considered and isn't reflected in the council's approach. Madam, I'd ask you to look at page 125 of appendix 4 of the study that looks at Stanmore area.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, Mr. Cowles. Oh, sorry, I didn't give you the chance to. Sorry, that's my admin.
I think we're doing this to death in terms of Black Country, personally. Sorry, that's just, and I think you've probably heard our view on that. I think in terms of the DTC approach, we clearly had a significant conversation about that at stage 1. We have said on record, both at the stage 1 hearings, and we are happy to say it again now, this is an on-running conversation. But I think your points made last week, Ma'am, were, you know, this has to, we have to move on with this. And we would support that. We have an agreed position through an updated statement of common ground, which confirms that those councils continue to be in support of our proposals, and inevitably in future local plan reviews, we will continue to cooperate as best we can with all our neighbours, including the Black Country. So, and reports like the West Midlands Strategic Economic Growth, and that's not the title, is it? The West Midlands Strategic Employment Sites Report will clearly be evidence in guiding those conversations in the future. Evidence is provided at various points in processes, as we all know, but plan making needs to carry on. And I'll just leave it there. It's a very good point, actually. And the fact, if I just say, Mum, just a final point, obviously we were part of the steering group behind that report as well. So Shropshire Council, as I said, was in scope, or Shropshire was in scope as an area of potential supply, not as need. We were round the table as part of those conversations, and I think that gets to the heart, I think, of continued cooperation with all our West Midlands neighbours, in fact, in that context. So, yes, thank you.
Okay, so just in terms of the, I think you called them outcomes and records of DTC meetings, was that your term?
Yes.
Are those publicly available, or are part of the evidence base for the examination? Are they on the website?
the conversations that took place, the last published evidence was to inform the hearing discussion from January 23. So we had a specific DTC hearing on that in January 2023 because of that precise issue. There was a need for us to show our workings, in effect, and we did that. At that point, that led on to the conclusion in ID 28 that we'd met the duty, or the legal duty in that context. Those reports were specifically up to the point of submission, because we all know we cannot rectify a legal DTC issue. So we haven't proposed anything post submission, or we haven't published anything post submission. As I indicated last week, Shropshire County, our main vehicle for continued cooperation is through a West Midlands housing needs group, officers housing needs group, which Shropshire sits on, and we have continued active involvement within that group. That does have, that is minuted. If it is absolutely necessary, and in order for you to indicate continued conversations between us and the West Midlands and BC particularly, we could seek to have those put in. However, I do not think they are necessary to either the legal or the soundness points that I think are being raised. I mean, I'm not, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what in context they're being raised in, to be honest, because the DTC is up to the point of submission. So I'm slightly, so we would almost be talking about DTC for the next local plan period, wouldn't we? In this context, I'm a bit confused about that, to be honest.
Yeah, not looking it to open it up, just asking the questions about those records really, and where, from my understanding as to how they sit with the examination. So I think really we'll take that away. I don't think there's anything we're looking to.
Just for reference, Marm, it's GC14 and GC15 with the appendices A to L that document the material that we provided for the additional stage 1 hearing.
Sorry,
Madam, just to be clear, I'm sure you have the point. I know Mr. West doesn't, but the point is the duty to cooperate is an ongoing duty. It doesn't just stop at the point of submission, and you need to be satisfied, specifically in the context of this plan where you don't have the authority group that in existence anymore, that gave rise to the original series of meetings, plus the fact there has been a stop and start to this process, which required further cooperation with the Black Country. So, Madam, that is why legally we say you need to know that there has been that ongoing cooperation, and you know, I think it is quite clear from the MPPF and the duty that that's what it is. It's not just the consortium that is urging you to see these records. It is in order to make this robust. It is to be helpful.
Yeah, probably worth me picking this up because I was around at that time and Miss Worthington wasn't, so it's kind of hard to pick up to remember what's happened. So yeah, there's the legal duty is up to the point of submission, and it's a soundness point beyond there, isn't it, in terms of what's ongoing and things. I suppose the question has been quite blunt. Are you aware of these minutes, and is there something in them that you think is a bombshell we need to see, kind of, you know, is there a reason, or is it just pure interest?
But Madam, we don't have enough information from the Statement of Common Ground. You, Madam, and your fellow inspector don't have enough information from Statement of Common Ground from the Black Country authorities to set out where they saw the discussions going at the time that the local plan and NABCA stopped existing. So you do not have that information other than a very simple statement of common ground that talks about it being appropriate. And so there is a gap in terms of the duty to cooperate. And Madam, it is an ongoing duty. It's not just at the end of submission. The duty is ongoing.
Yeah, I think that's something. Do you want to say something, Mr. Richard? I think so. We need to go away and have a think about.
You need to think about it. Yes, of course, there is an ongoing duty in respect of plan making, not in respect of this plan, but in respect of plan making generally, and it's plan making in respect of future Shropshire plans. There is an ongoing duty of cooperation. And there's, of course, a duty in respect of future Black Country plans, in whatever form the Black Country decide eventually to bring them forward in. But there is nothing that you need to see to be able to reach the conclusion, we say, that this plan was legally compliant. Now, if you need to, in terms of soundness, to see any further evidence going behind, for example, the most recent statement of common ground, then no doubt you will ask us. But that's essentially a soundness point for you to reach a judgment on, we say.
Madam, I'm not going to respond to that. I've made my points, but there was a wrong reference from me earlier on. It wasn't the study. It was GC 44 that had the table that I referred to. It's Appendix 4, page 125 of GC 44.
Okay, so it's Mr. Kells.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to say something briefly about the West Midlands report mentioned before the Black Country. And one other thing I think important to say, given the comments that were made about the loss of the Shrewsbury site, just to reiterate from our point of view, if there is a problem about the Shrewsbury site, it's a problem to be sorted out in Shrewsbury. Allocating sites elsewhere in the county would not resolve that problem because it's about quality. So, you know, allocating more sites in the sites that have been talked about in the Black Country would not, in our view, be a solution. I just wanted to come to that report, the West Midlands employment report that's come out recently. I don't have the inquiry number for it, I'm afraid, because I'm not up to date. It is a useful. It's not a document I've had enough time to look through in detail. I know the kind of document it is because back in the day when we had regional spatial strategies, which I look back to with some joy, and I worked with Liam on that, this would have been the document that would have been the precursor to then identifying some strategic sites of at least 25 hectares that would fulfill the needs of the region. And we would have looked at the overall need of the region and said, well, these are the sites that need to be identified. And there is a figure, figure 1.1 in that report, which is a map. And I think Mr. West was referring to it earlier because it includes the Shropshire M54 corridor. It includes several other corridors, and I'm sure you've looked at them. It's a very wide study. It has a number of green sites, which are the top scoring sites. and the bottom scoring sites. Now, I'm going to ask you to be cautious about those for a very specific reason, because if you look at the very top of that map, you will see a lovely yellow site. And I'm assuming I've got it right because it's such a small thing. That is junction 16, I think, of the M6, I'm pretty sure. I know the site because I've been acting for people who are concerned about it, and that is a site in the Newcastle Underline Regulation 19 plan. So it's not a site which is you know, at the bottom of a planning process. It's near the top. And the reason I say that is because it is tempting to look at a thing like this and say, well, the green ones are all the ones that should happen and the yellow ones are the ones that shouldn't happen. But actually, this is not related necessarily to what is happening in local plans. So those sites may come forward, and that's one of the reasons it's a great shame we don't have regional planning anymore, because we for all these reasons. So these are a number of sites that have been put forward and areas that are being put forward, and at this stage are being looked at. There is a need. That need has to, you know, in terms of meeting that need, and it's for large sites. It's not just for general employment sites, as we know. We need to go. The next stage will be to identify some sites, to look at where was the best places, to look at what supply we could find, and it may well be that there are more sites there than there is supply. So I think that's why I would say one should be cautious in going straight from that to saying, because that identifies as a possibility the M54 corridor, that is the best option when it is all looked for, when you take it further. I haven't had a detailed look at it, so that's some quite general points. The second thing I want to say, though, is then to say about the specifics of the Black Country and identifying the Shirehall site. Our view, and we've expressed it, is that the need, the requirement is generous. Therefore, there is not a there's not a need that, you know, there is flexibility if sites don't match up. In this case, we're talking about a greenbelt site where there is a requirement for exceptional circumstances, and you will hear evidence on that. I'm not presenting it, but you will hear evidence on that, and it will be for you to make your judgment on that. But it does seem to us that with the generous supply, there is supply of employment land that could meet this need. And then I wanted to come on to one, in a sense, final point, which is in regard to why that site has been identified in regards to meeting employment land in the Black Country. And I don't want to go too much over what we did last week, but there was a huge amount of emphasis placed on people who were living in Wolverhampton or whatever and would be driving their car out to this site in Shirehall or getting the train. And huge emphasis was placed on that, and therefore that was why it should be the Black Country. It should be the place to meet the Black Country need. And I expressed then my concern that I think this is a migration plan and that this is actually just migration into Shropshire, and it will be increased. And I just want to draw your attention to table 7.4, Shropshire labour supply balance in GC 45. And you'll see there how they've come up with the figure of 25,420. and you'll see under managing Shropshire's commuting relationship with neighbours and closely related authorities, influence commuting patterns towards equilibrium, and then plus commuting between Shropshire and Aberdeen through meeting 30 hectares of unmet employment land need, 2,300. Now, I think I've got this right, that this is saying that there need to be 2,300 people in Shropshire because of this 30 hectares of unmet employment land. Now, I would like confirmation about how that fits in with the idea that actually the employment land is going to all be people who live in the Black Country, who therefore we have to provide, who will commute to it. I'm not convinced about that. And I think, again, that is something you need to ask. Is that realistic in terms of the exceptional circumstances required for this land, if part of those exceptional circumstances is to be meeting that Black Country need, if this commuting actually, is it a real approach? Because to me, identifying any land in Shropshire is significantly unsustainable in terms of its relationship to the Black Country. That's the points I want to make. Thank you.
Councillor, like to respond on any of those points?
Yes, I'm I think just taking a few, just going, I think it's Mr. Kells's first point, just I think slightly off the question, but as you raised it, so I think it's worth responding to. I think if I summarise you correctly, effectively, SHR 166, just going back to that for 1 second, that's a Shrewsbury issue rather than a Shropshire issue, and I think that's kind of we would agree on that context. So if there's if there is concern about that, we would we've set out our approach, and we did that under question 1. If there is a need to reflect upon that, we do think that is a Shrewsbury based issue rather than a wider county issue. So we're in agreement there. I know. In terms of the BC, and again, I think it's going to the. I don't want to place too much emphasis really on, because we haven't put it into the examination. Obviously others have, which is the West Midlands strategic employment sites. So we don't rely upon that for our evidence on this one. I know others have put it in, and it's included on the other documents under the examination library pages on that one. Now we would say that is a piece of evidence. The intention of that is to help support future plan making, but it freely acknowledges that the plan making process is not the same as this process. It's not as easy as saying there's a dot on a map, that's the one we're having in the plan. There's more to it than that, and that's for the plan making process to do that. It also is a policy off strategy as well, with particularly in terms of the green belt issue. It's a policy off approach. So clearly that is another consideration which would need to be taken into account through the plan making process. That's freely acknowledged in that process. We don't rely on this at all. It's come in relatively late in the day. We very much see this as an opportunity for us to effectively be a part of our own on-running cooperation. And it is an on-running process. I agree with that. So there's that point. And is Shirehall an opportunity area? It is identified in that opportunity area. So as I said, it is consistent with that, but we don't actually rely upon that. In terms of the Shirehall specific questions, I think you've probably heard our comments quite extensively on this, why we feel as though Shirehall is through the both the essay process and then subsequently through wider considerations in the topic paper, why that site has been proposed to accommodate those needs. We covered that, I think, last week. Unless you want us to cover that again, we'll stop there. I think if there's anything else anymore. And sorry, there was an issue about alignment as well. I think Mr. Kells has raised that. Again, that point was dealt with last week, and around the specific point about the labour supply point, which obviously housing is part of, but not our only source of labour supply. In the table that we articulated last week in the topic paper, 17 points. Sorry, 70 points. So I'm looking at the wrong table. So that is the one. Oh, sorry. So yeah, that identifies our alignment proposals. So yeah, I don't want to repeat anything I said last week. That was our proposals that we articulated last week.
Just one other thing, Mom. With regards to commuting patterns, obviously Mr. Kells suggested he didn't think it's credible to see commuting between Shropshire and the Black Country. Well, there are established commuting patterns between the two areas. They informed our consideration of whether a contribution to the Black Country was appropriate in the first instance, and they informed our approach in terms of identification of a reasonable assessment geography when we were looking at sites to accommodate those contributions. Figures 12.3 and 12.4 of GC 44, the additional essay work, provide a sort of breakdown of that commuting by place plan area, which illustrate those patterns exist. So there are existing commuting patterns between the two areas. What the proposed strategy seeks to facilitate is increased levels of commuting in recognition that there is not, based on our discussions with the Black Country, there will not be sufficient land available within their areas to meet the needs they have for employment. So it's a positive response to the circumstances that are arising in the Black Country, in the same way that housing provision will increase migration trends between Shropshire and the Black Country, existing trends, again, that have informed our approach based on the fact that the Black Country conclude that there is insufficient land to meet their housing needs.
Thank you. Did you want to come back?
It was only a very small point, and it's me not being as clear as I should be. I'm not suggesting there aren't commuting links between Shropshire and Black Country. I'm suggesting this is not a sustainable option for meeting the housing needs through increasing that commuting. And it was me that wasn't perhaps as clear as I should have been.
Fine, that's helpful. Thank you. Mr. Brogden.
Thank you. Just picking up on question 2 itself and the statement of common ground that was issued in October 24. The statement of common ground under 2.1a states that the extent of any unmet need is not established within an adopted development plan framework. So the current position of the local authorities is they haven't determined the extent of any unmet need. Therefore, I wonder whether the question that you've posed, Ma'am, referring to the need to fulfil the identified unmet need is actually incorrect. It should be to fulfil the unidentified unmet need, because we actually don't know what their need is. So that's my first point. Is Shropshire then go on to say in the statement of common ground that they have effectively offered, I'm paraphrasing here, but offered 1,500 dwellings on 30 hectares. That's not the same as the Black Country saying they need 30 hectares. So that's my point, is I don't think we have an identified unmet need. There is an unmet need within the statement of common ground, but they haven't said how much. My comment then following on from that is, leading up, in addition to the comments I've already made in submission, is referring back to the windfall sites. To meet an unmet need, the windfall sites can deliver to any need that is identified by the neighbouring local authorities. And I think last week the council said one of the reasons they wanted to identify land purely for the Black Country needs was so they can monitor. But if this is in respect of employment land, if that 30 hectares is effectively a commuting site, again I'm using paraphrasing here to keep it simple, then we will know which sites within Shropshire are to meet the Black Country needs, because it will be purely for a Black Country employer or someone who is employing people from the Black Country, and that will be clear in any application. So from a monitoring point of view, you don't need to identify a site and say that is the reserve or preserve of the Black Country. It will become clear where the Black Country employers are relocating to within Shropshire. The significant oversupply that's been identified can meet that need through windfall sites, and so we don't need a specific allocation in Shirehall to meet the Black Country needs, which are not yet known.
Okay, thank you. I think we did hear some of that last week as well. Yeah. So yes. Okay. Would the council like to respond on that then?
Just in terms of the level of unmet need, I think that it's worthwhile saying that even with the hiatus of, or the pause, should we say, of the Shropshire local plan examination, there hasn't been substantial progress through to examination on any of the BC authorities' local plans either. So there's still basically the position on level of unmet need is as the statements of common ground, the original statements of common ground in terms of levels. There's nothing substantial that's arisen in the meantime to indicate anything other than that. Clearly, it's a point which you've raised as well, Marm, about the that will be examined for this, but it's a choice of. And I think the DTC does say this, isn't it? It's respond now, don't kick the can, effectively, isn't it? On this one, to paraphrase incredibly wildly and probably inaccurately, but you get the point. So we've sought to do that. Just out of interest, the Dudley Reg 19 plan, just out of interest, has been published for consultation. Last week, in fact, that is currently they are consulting on that plan for a period of six weeks, and that specifically includes a DTC statement, which specifically identifies the Shropshire contribution of 1,500 dwellings and 30 hectares, and identifies, in line with the updated statement of common ground that we have put in fairly recently, the one of this month, a mechanism that they may or may not have agreed with their neighbours around how to split that 1,500 up for their own purposes. So I think that they come to 430 of the 1,500 is for their purposes. So clearly there's a slicing up game there, which we have specifically referenced in the updated statements of common ground. So it's just trying to articulate that this process is being used in emerging local plans. It hasn't got to that point yet of examination, but it is being actively used. So yeah, I think that was just a point I wanted to make there, really, on the ECC rates.
Just a couple of points, Marm. Just by way of clarification, in para 2.1a, Mr. Brogden suggested it says we don't know what the needs are. What that's actually explaining is that the level of unmet need is not established within an adopted development plan. Obviously, the original statement of common ground talks about the emerging evidence, and that is still the most up-to-date evidence as far as the council is aware of the level of unmet need. Clearly, that's something that will be considered further through the ongoing plan-making processes in the Black Country authorities. Also, in terms of Mr. Brogden's point about monitoring, obviously we've already addressed why the council has identified specific sites to accommodate contributions, and that was primarily in seeking to positively respond to the interim findings ID 28, where there was a recognition of the fact that identification of sites makes it more straightforward and transparent in terms of whether the contributions are actually being accommodated. Mr. Brogden suggested that if you look where where people are employed when a planning application comes in, that would allow you to do that. Unfortunately, we don't generally get that level of information in any planning application. We wouldn't know where the employees are based. And indeed, we don't really need to know that information to determine if the application is appropriate. Similarly, Mr. Brogden suggested that we can look where the employers are currently located. And again, unfortunately, it's not as simple as that, because it's not necessarily existing employers that we're meeting the needs of. It also includes employers that would have looked to locate in the Black Country, but because there isn't the land available, their area of section effectively expands, and that's where our contribution comes in effect. So whilst I appreciate the principle, unfortunately, the system and the information available to council just wouldn't allow us to operate a monitoring framework in that way. I think it was suggested the same with housing in the past. And again, unfortunately, we don't know where residents are coming from. And obviously, that's not something we're required to know. And understandably, a developer wouldn't know it either. So what we feel is the approach that we've proposed positively responds to RD28 and allows for us to monitor the contributions and ensure that they're met, whilst obviously not restricting the use of those sites in any way. But it does provide confidence that those contributions are being met, which I think is the point, really. So hopefully that provides a bit of clarity in terms of why we are where we're at in terms of those particular issues.
Mr. Brogden, do you have anything else on that?
I must admit, I'm unclear as to how you can monitor, if you can't monitor the applications to know where they're coming from, how you can then assess that the 30 hectares to meet the Black Country needs is actually being met. The monitoring has got to be suitable to identify that you are actually meeting those needs. And if you can do that, then you can do it through either windfall sites or a specific allocation in a specific location.
Okay, did you want to, I mean, I think it's a case I've heard both sides, really. Yeah. Mr. Kaz.
Sorry, ma'am, and I don't want to test you because I know you were keen not to go back over the Black Country too much, but Mr. West did mention the Dudley plan, and I just think it's important to stress, I looked at it recently, I think the shortfall in Dudley is 677 houses. So I think the relevance of Dudley to, as it stands under this standard methodology, I don't think it's particularly relevant. And, you know, we produced evidence in our statements regarding the conurbation overall and what's happening in Birmingham, which I think is going to be far more relevant to the serious meeting of unmet need across the conurbation. But I just, because Dudley was mentioned, I just want to make clear, Dudley is not an authority which is in, would consider itself, I think, to be in trouble over housing at present.
Okay, just coming back on that, I'm conscious about this isn't evidence before you, Marv, on this one, but I think it's contextually, it's quite interesting that it's quite recent and up to date. The Dudley Reg 19 plan does identify a shortfall against their standard methodology, current standard methodology, not future standard methodology. I think it's current standard methodology of, yeah, I think it's about 650, something like 650. So they are reliant on contributions from elsewhere to make up that, to present in their eyes, obviously they're thinking about examination as well and thinking about that. So they are reliant on the 400 and whatever it is from Shropshire to make up the 600 shortfall. That is the case, Mr. Kells, because I read it last week. It is the case. So that's what their statement says. They are reliant on unmet need. They're positive conversations which they've had to make up that, and they are using a proportion of the 1,500 to make up that. Now, we haven't been party to any conversations between them and their own neighbours around how they've sought to slice up the 1,500. As we've said in the statement of common ground, that's not our business, effectively. So, but it's just a point worth making that, yes, we're not talking about significant numbers, but there is a shortfall identified, and they're using the 1,500 to meet that shortfall, and that's just the fact of the matter.
Okay, I've got those points, and we are going beyond really where we needed to be. That's fine. Thank you. The problem is that a legacy. Yeah, thank you. So if we move to question 3, should the employment land requirement be also expressed in terms of the number of jobs expected to be provided? Can I ask the council for their view on that?
Apologies. The council considers this to be impractical. Firstly, the jobs growth targets are difficult to define because many of the floor spaces, many land uses that are identified in policy SP 13 are extremely difficult to define in terms of floor space requirements per job. In our employment density guide, our Bible, published in 2015. So SP 13 land uses don't necessarily lend themselves to accurate methods of prediction. The local authority can specifically influence how sites are developed in terms of size, density and uses. So the outturn, it's very difficult to then dictate to the end users that will take this floor space, and that makes it difficult to identify and deliver prescribed jobs targets. The council considers that a more appropriate focus for the employment land requirement is to positively influence the provision of land and the efficiency of its development, which is what the local plan does. The draft local plan seeks to deliver these outcomes through its policies, settlement strategies and proposed site allocations.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything on question 3? I don't have any questions. Mr. Kells.
Sorry, it's just a small point in regard to it comes out of the way the jobs per hectare are calculated, and quite a lot of emphasis is put on this to get to the 25,000 or so jobs we have, is that they rely on 67 jobs per hectare. But as we've said, and that is quite clear, a significant amount of this is recycled land, that is land which comes through churn, and the council is expecting that and anticipating that. So where land comes forward through churn, you will not produce the jobs per hectare. For the simple reason, if I close down my factory and move out, I don't create any more jobs in that new factory. And when that factory is churned into a new factory, I produce my 67.07. So I've got 2 hectares of land, but only 1 creation. And the simple reason for mentioning that is that, and it feeds back into the discussions you've had about is there enough people for the jobs, is that that means that there is potential for considerable overcounting of jobs that will be created through this land supply to get to that 25,000 figures. And for that reason, apart from anything, the uncertainty in the number of jobs provided means that expressing it in terms of the number of jobs would be unlikely to be correct and could be misleading.
Yeah.
I was going to come back on the replacement points made by Mr. Kells, but I didn't because, in fact, replacement forms a part of need, and need has already been found sound. But the clarification point is that the replacement doesn't include churn. It doesn't include the turnover of existing employment areas through investment to modernise the floor space. The heading is very clear. It's loss replacement, and that loss replacement has been calculated from the employment land lost to housing over the period from 2014 through to 2020. And the advice from Litchfields is that you need to start to replace your stock which is extremely old. 70% of Shropshire's stock was built before 1970, 70%. In the region, it's 62, and in England and Wales, it's 63. So we have to start replacing the stock, and it is literally replacing stock that has gone to other uses. We were offered a range of replacement rates. So those replacement rates went from trying to replace it within 50 years to trying to replace it in 250 years. And we went for a trend-based position, i.e. the land we were losing from housing development taking employment floor space. And that gave us a replacement rate of 125 years. So we're taking a median approach, but what we are trying to do is modernise our building stock, because we do lose a significant amount of employment land to housing development.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Okay, anything else on question 3? Okay, is there anything else then that anybody wants to, hasn't found somewhere to hang their hat, as it were, in terms of employment requirement or supply generally under matter 4? I don't need any repeating, but if there's anything new that we haven't had a chance to cover, then we can deal with that. This it would be now. No, okay, thank you. So that thanks everybody for. Oh, sorry, no. Mr. Harris.
It's just whether the point that I was making about reuse and regeneration of existing industrial land, rather than taking more land out of Greenbelt. And that's referenced my comments to the Shropshire Employment Land Review, December 2019. And that would be, we can give a response on that.
A response from the council, you mean?
Yeah, it's just that again we're talking about churn or reusing, and there's land in Shirehall that is either set aside or scrubland and existing employment land or industrial sites, but they're not. It would be good if they were seen to be part of a shorter term provision rather than being safeguarded.
The council had to respond on that point.
I'm not quite clear on the land area that you believe could replace the proposed allocation. You indicated the little bubble that sits around Shirehall Industrial Estate. Yeah. But within there was only Shirehall Industrial Estate that was a brownfield site. The rest of the land is either part of the built form of the town or represents open greenfield land within the green belt. So the council has taken account of brownfield sites where it's possible to do so, but has found that largely for particularly strategic sites, it's necessary to consider the greenfield options.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, the confusion is that this land was in the original Shirehall Enterprise Zone area and was seen to be suitable for redevelopment and expansion. So that's just a point I would make.
Yeah, and we've seen the statements on for both sides on that, so I think that we'll just take that one away. Okay, so I think that concludes matter 4. Oh, sorry.
It's only a procedural. Sorry, it's only a procedural matter, and it may be that I raise it with your programme officer. But it struck me in listening to a number of points made today that when we come to matter 9, there may be some additional evidence that's required to respond to some of the matters raised by other representees, as it were, which I was just, in my view, it's often better to have things in writing rather than trying to read it all out and for you to have it noted down. And I'm not sure if there is provision to add to hearing statements, but we would like to do so. And I just wondered if that was permissible, and if so, what sort of timescale?
So is it because there's new evidence come forward, or I mean, it's not, you can't just kind of keep developing your hearing statements.
It's more to do with points being raised by those who are objecting generally to. So it's in effect to assist the council in its response to objections, but it has to do with our Matter 9 response, and therefore it's how to get that evidence before you that's in writing. It may be that we simply supply.
Press the rock. I don't know what that button was, but I think, yeah, in those circumstances, I think it's often better if you speak through the council. If it's something to support the council's evidence, then and I have had people sit with the council at sessions, or maybe it's a chat beforehand or whatever, but I think that's probably the better way to do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam. I just want to be sure.
Is the council happy with that approach?
You were fine with that. Yeah, we're fine with that approach. Whatever really suits on that one, and we'll obviously have a conversation with colleagues over there, and whether they want to sit beside us or not, I don't know. We'll have a conversation, shall we? But yes, it will be introduced into the examination. I think it is relevant, and it is new, and it is responding to points. So I think it is relevant. But yeah, happy to do that.
That's fine. Okay. Was that everything, Ms. Cahoon? Thank you. No, so I think if there's nobody else, then we've obviously carried on a little bit after when we said for lunch. There's no point breaking. We kind of get a sense that things are drawing to an end. So yeah, we'll be back here at 9:30 in the morning for the last two matters of these strategic sessions. Okay. Thank you. Can we leave things here again, or is there a meeting? If we want to leave things in here, that's